A customer requests changes to a contract and their supplier accepts, but nobody writes down what was agreed. 6 months later, there's a dispute over what additional work should have been done and how much is to be paid. I'm Mike, founder of Starlit Contracts, where we help you to negotiate and use contracts with confidence. We're looking at variations, change orders and amendments in this video. Two parties negotiated a deal, they signed a contract and might be performing it right now. Then one of them wants to change something. That's where variations, change orders and amendments come in. Most well-drafted contracts will include a methodology for handling amendments. You can think of it as a roadmap. It tells each party what steps to follow when someone wants to make a change to the scope of work or to some other part of a contract. Should you care? Well, ask yourself this question. Is there any chance your contract might need to change at some point? If the answer is yes, and it often is, then it's good practice to have a clear process for formalizing an amendment before anyone's obliged to act on that change. Let's look at a practical example together. Television Supplier Limited entered into a contract with customer to supply 1,000 televisions. Customer wants to connect audio equipment to the televisions and requests that supplier provides the audio equipment too. What could go right for the supplier? The supplier specializes in televisions, not in audio equipment, and the contract states that the parties must pre-agree to any amendment in writing. This means that the supplier has a choice. They could work with a subcontractor to source the audio equipment, or they could decide it's not worth the effort. Maybe the margins don't stack up, or they're just not comfortable taking on the additional work. If the supplier decides against it, they can simply inform the customer that they're not willing to accept the amendment. What could go wrong for the supplier? Here's where things can get tricky. Let's say that the customer has a contractual right to instruct the supplier to implement amendments so long as they relate to the original scope of work. In that case, the customer could say, "Look, the audio equipment relates directly to the televisions, so you're required to give us a quote and implement the amendment at our request." If the supplier doesn't cooperate in accordance with their obligations, then they could be in breach of the contract and be liable for damages. Let's look at a sample clause now. Either party may request an amendment to the agreement. The request must be in writing and in sufficient detail for the other party to evaluate the potential impact. Your first consideration is whether the right to request amendments should be one-way or two-way. One-way clauses typically give customers the right to request changes. A two-way clause like this one gives both contract parties that right. And our clause continues. If the request is acceptable in principle to the other party, then the parties will use their reasonable and commercially prudent efforts to amend the agreement. See the phrase reasonable and commercially prudent efforts. It means that both parties can keep their commercial interests in mind when negotiating an amendment. Neither party gets forced into a deal that puts them at a disadvantage. You could swap this language for all reasonable efforts, best efforts, or use of endeavours, but be careful. Depending on the law that governs the contract, stronger wording can change the obligation and give a party less room to protect their commercial position. The clause continues. Neither party is obliged to perform an amendment unless and until both parties sign the amendment to the agreement in writing. This part's crucial. If you only agree to an amendment verbally and there's a dispute later, then it's your word against theirs. Aim to get amendments documented in writing and signed before starting work on them. Let's bring it all together with some key takeaways. First, it's common for a contract to set out a process to make an amendment. Make sure that yours does too, if an amendment is foreseeable. Second, determine if the right to request or instruct amendments is one-way or two-way. This affects the balance of power between the parties, and it's worth negotiating carefully. Finally, record amendments in writing before starting work. Verbal agreements are difficult to enforce and are more likely to result in disagreements. If you're ready to take your next step to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, then visit us at starlitcontracts.com, where you can access more content, participate in interactive sessions, and be part of our community.